the abduction of President Maduro. That comes after several months of U.S. military buildup in the region and a series of kind of escalating rhetoric, as well as these attacks, kind of more isolated attacks on a number of different alleged drug boats. And so it kind of came to a head at one point where there's large U.S. military force in the region. It seems like they sort of needed to, after these months of buildup. Yeah, there's an interesting thing going on here in terms of the justification, where it's not clear that what's actually being used to justify this is the real reason that the U.S. went in the first place. Trump really seems keen to use the idea of Venezuela's massive oil reserves as the justification, kind of putting this really crude economic, kind of neo-imperialist logic on it. It's not clear that that's really was the driving force behind this. A lot of that might have to do with just the kind of spectacular element of it, the sort of rabid anti-communism of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as this kind of like broader dominance that the US is trying to exert in Latin America, which is something that you of course see throughout history. And so I think there's these kind of longer range forces that actually maybe were the real reason for it. But a lot of it's really oil or alleged, narco trafficking that's being used to kind of justify it to the American population. There's been a lot of contradictory information on this. At first, in this kind of now infamous press conference, right as they were kind of announcing the results of this strike and abduction, Trump said, we're going to run Venezuela as long as we have to, boots on the ground, no problem, which really comes as like a direct contradiction to his whole campaign promise, saying, we're not going to do what the Bush administration did. We're not going to get embroiled. We're not going to have boots on the ground. And Trump all of a sudden sounds, more neocon than Donald Rumsfeld. Of course, his administration then, as they have to do often, kind of backpedals and says, no, we're going to kind of just coerce them into following the U.S. desires. We're not actually going to directly run it through, some sort of, colonial viceroy administration. And so now it seems like what they're going to do is effectively have the now acting president, Rodriguez, who seems like she's sort of, reached some arrangement with the U.S. regime, that the U.S. will effectively kind of dictate terms to her, and then she'll, and the whole, Maduro kind of apparatus there will actually govern the country, with, of course, this kind of sort of Damocles hanging over their head of like, look what we did to your former boss, and we can do that to you if you don't follow our interests kind of to the T. And that does allow her then to kind of at least rhetorically speak to a Venezuelan population to say, oh, we're going to sort of at least a little bit resist or stand up to the U.S. Like it's not so obviously a puppet government. So in that way, it might be a clever solution, even if it's sort of morally wanting. Greenland seems even kind of more preposterous because there's actually some economic, geopolitical logic to what's going on in Venezuela. There is the oil, right? There is this kind of long-standing animosity, especially with the Chavez and now Maduro governments. And so, you can kind of see the logic there. It still seemed kind of fantastical. But of course, that did in fact happen. And now Greenland, I guess, seems some kind of dramatic action there now seems more plausible because we see how kind of ridiculous and extreme the Trump administration is willing to be in actions such as in Venezuela. There's a lot of, the logic for Greenland, though, as I said, is even kind of more bizarre or hard to discern because the U.S. has the ability to station its troops anywhere it wants there. Denmark, which controls Greenland, they're a very close U.S. ally. The U.S. has stationed troops there since 1941. They've just closed a lot of those bases after the Cold War. So it's not really clear what the U.S. would get out of, quote, owning Greenland that it doesn't have already. It seems to be the sort of, the inherited kind of real estate mindset of Trump thinking that, no, we don't want to just have access to it. We want to actually, quote, own it. And for this, he cites, again, a mix of, I guess, economic and more geopolitical reasons, saying, well, look, the Arctic is this really contested zone. We need to have Greenland, and also citing the rare earth minerals there. But again, it's not clear actually how accessible those would be given the climate. Again, it's this mix of, there's some sort of actual interest you could discern and a reason for it, but those just pale in comparison to how dramatic the action would be to actually take it. And it seems like the real logic behind it is much more just sort of ideological or based on the whims of, one man or his kind of coterie of other radicals. I mean, of course, there's already been this strike on Iran, and the U.S. you could kind of see as being embroiled in like a long-standing economic war with Cuba. We might not be doing the Bay of Pigs currently, but really there's been almost a state of economic war going back to the early '60s. Cuba, again, talk about a thorn in the side of the U.S. going back decades. Cuba's kind of the original one in the hemisphere. And Marco Rubio, with his origins as a kind of right-wing Cuban emigre family, that's sort of his, I think, great dream is overthrowing the communist government in Cuba. The lack of oil, the potential lack of oil shipments from Venezuela could sort of affect that regime negatively anyway, and they hope trigger the collapse of the Cuban government. They've withstood a lot over time. There's no real way of knowing. But I think Trump has said that, well, Cuba might just collapse on its own weight. We might not need to do regime change there. Iran, it's tough to see, right? Because it looks like there's a lot of internal pressure anyway. Is the U.S. going to actually go in and try to kind of put its thumb on the scale, tip the balance there in a more overt way? I'm sure there's covert putting the thumb on the scale there. But it does kind of stand in tension with, again, what I started with in terms of Trump promising and really a lot of his appeal to the Republican base, saying we're not going to get embroiled in these foreign wars. We're not going to have the quagmire like Iraq. And if we do actually attack somewhere, we're going to get their resources. That's where the Venezuela thing comes from. But it's hard to see any type of real sustained or meaningful action in Iran or Cuba that doesn't really embroil the U.S. and doesn't do exactly what Trump doesn't want to get into, which is looking weak, which is having Americans come home in body bags and just sort of and look non-decisive, right? There's this similar element to a lot of these attacks, which is that they're dramatic and they are very quick. Right, with the Fordo bombings or with this operation in Venezuela, there's been other bombings, Yemen and Nigeria. He likes, he likes seeing the special forces go in and doing something dramatic. He likes the high-tech bombers to, drop something new and novel. And it's this, it's the spectacle, right? But I don't think there's the patience or the stomach for any kind of long-term occupation, which might be really the only thing tempering the erratic and extreme behavior of this administration. In terms of priorities, it's actually maybe even more difficult to discern it than it was in the past. I think we know more about its foreign policy instincts in a way, right? There's a sort of a short attention span, a desire for really dramatic actions that play to the base and ideally intimidate the rest of the world. Not through this broader, what you could call a hegemonic project of the post-1945 era where, yes, the US does have the strongest military. Yes, it will sanction you if you do something it doesn't like. But at the same time, there's a desire to have the US get what it wants without actually having to send in Delta Force, right? This sort of the appeal of culture and diplomacy and things like this. And I think we can tell from this Trump administration especially that there's almost no patience for that, right? It's strength or the threat of strength, and by strength I mean narrowly military strength to get what it wants. In terms of a kind of broader ordering or a worldview, as I said earlier, that's kind of hard to discern. We can maybe see this long-standing, I guess, move away from Europe to some extent, and a real focus on the Western Hemisphere. They're constantly talking about the Western Hemisphere, talking about the Donroe Doctrine, riffing off of the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the U.S. wouldn't tolerate any European imperialism in Latin America. And so I think we can see, in some ways, a retreat to the U.S.'s own, sort of sphere or hemisphere of influence. But that's not the whole story, because of course the U.S. still shows this willingness to kind of lash out and strike at other targets when it feels provoked or when it thinks there's an opportunity there. So I would say we can discern an abandonment of this global hegemonic project, but it's definitely not fair to call that isolationism or to really identify any kind of more coherent school of thought or a real kind of foreign policy doctrine that you could talk about in an international relations textbook a decade from now.